Depuis toujours, dans notre vieille famille, on est ailleurs, de père en fils. Depuis 100 ans, là-haut l'enseigne brille, dans la rue de l'écrevisse. Mets-toi le nez, plongé dans les livres, tu étudies au lieu de bien couper. Ce n'est pas tout, hein, il faut aussi vivre. Gagner l'argent au lieu de rêvasser. Schmile, tes vêtements n'ont pas de style. T'es pas un tailleur habile. Regarde la fille du voisin, comme déjà il coupe bien. Ses pantalons, ses gilets, ses vestons. Quel bonheur pour les parents d'avoir au monde un tel enfant. Ta jambe gauche, elle est trop longue. Ta jambe droite, n'en parlons pas. Tu seras toujours quelconque. Si tu ne m'écoutes pas, Schmile, tes vêtements n'ont pas de style. T'es pas un tailleur habile. Et je suis désespéré.
Paris was already fascinating in the interwar period. It was a glorious city where the victory of World War I was celebrated in 1918. The Popular Front had given communists a place in cultural life, and in 1937, the Exposition Internationale saw the construction of the Palais de Chaillot.
It's important to put all of this in context. In the interwar period, Paris was really the city of lights. People from all over the world came here to have a good time.
The Paris Opera was as prestigious as it had been in the 19th century. France's artistic identity was heavily intertwined with the Palais Garnier.
The Comédie Française was enjoying a brilliant phase. Large attendances meant that it was very successful financially, as revenues were on the rise.
Les Invalides in 1939 was the military museum and the location of Napoleon's tomb.
It was symbolic of the spirit of defense.
At the dawn of the Second World War, Maxime's was probably Paris's most famous restaurant, which consequently made it the most famous restaurant in the world.
Just before the Second World War, the Palais de Chaillot was brand new. It would become a hotspot for Nazi entertainment. It was just the type of architecture the Führer liked.
But everything would change a few months later with the start of the war in 1939. The Nazis had conquered much of Europe. Now they set their sights on France and plotted their invasion. The Germans advanced through France quickly. Paris needed to prepare for the worst.
The French army's debacle forced its immediate surrender. It gave Paris to the Germans, and from then on, the city's greatest palaces and monuments belonged to the invaders.
The French were not expecting defeat in 1940. France was considered a powerful nation. At that time, the French army was said to be the best army in the world.
On June 11th, the capital was a free-for-all as the last children were evacuated. By June 13th, the Germans had spread to the suburbs.
On June 14th, when these perfectly well-dressed, strong, and very organized people marched down the street, everyone was simply flabbergasted.
That day, the Nazis became the masters of Paris.
Avenue Foch was named after one of the great victors of World War I, and yet that was where the German troops chose to enter Paris on June 14th, with a huge military parade just in front of the Arc de Triomphe.
When the Germans took over Paris, the Parisians, along with the rest of the French population, were absolutely traumatized.
The first signs of patriotism began to appear as soon as the Germans settled in. These famous images were taken on June 14th, 1940, the day the Germans marched on Paris. While many men weep, this elderly lady seems to yell, "Long live France, long live France." In the distance, others stand disapprovingly with their arms crossed. Unease was widespread. So were the first hints of the resistance, subtle gestures that would evolve into something greater.
The first thing the Germans did when they got to Paris was to take over the Place de la Concorde. Next, they moved towards the Eiffel Tower.
And yet the soldiers at the Eiffel Tower couldn't use the elevators. Someone had intentionally blocked them. They would have to use the stairs for the duration of the war. Even so, German flags sprang up throughout the city, proof the occupation had begun. The swastika now hung on the city's most symbolic monuments, the Eiffel Tower, the Grand Palais, the Arc de Triomphe, and the important hotels.
One morning they appeared, and then they were everywhere. The speed at which they took over proves that they were incredibly well prepared. In one day, they made themselves at home.
And of course, everything was filmed for use in German propaganda to show the swastika flag flying over Paris.
How would the occupying forces treat the capital they had conquered? As usual, the Germans took over the big hotels first, since they're designed to have ample reception space and have many rooms that can quickly be transformed into offices.
But above all, the hotels had telephone switchboards.
They took over Western Paris, where hotels were in larger numbers and wanted to enjoy Paris's luxuries. They set up their government's military headquarters at the Meurice, 228 Rue de Rivoli, in the heart of the capital. The palace was henceforth under their guard. The Abwehr, the counterintelligence agency, took the Lutetia. The German High Command took the Majestic on the Avenue Kléber, and the Ritz housed the aerial branch, the Luftwaffe, and became home base for any German dignitaries passing through Paris.
An American client once asked the director of the Ritz, Elmiger, "How did you know the Germans were coming?" And he said, "They made a reservation."
At midnight on June the 14th, the time changed to 1 a.m. Paris was now on German time, setting the clock to match Berlin. All seemed lost. Would France find a way to rise again? On June 17th, the new head of government, Marshal Pétain, asked the Germans for an armistice. It was signed on June 22nd near Compiègne. France was now officially divided into two, much to Hitler's delight, as he could count on France's collaboration in his quest to conquer Europe.
There's one excruciatingly humiliating image, which hurts me every time I see it. It's that of Hitler on the Trocadero, looking at the Eiffel Tower and Paris.
Hitler's visit to Paris felt like the proof of Germany's domination.
because I went to Israel as a chalutza in 1933, and I got married there in Ramat Gan, and I changed my name to a Hebrew name. Now my name is Yehudit Kochavi. People took off the yellow star. But I stay in line with the French people. Our Jewish girls, maybe 17, 18 years old, came with a yellow star. And the Germans were running away. They could, because they were mad, they could still arrest that girl. Then I went to her, I said to her, I am a Jewish woman, I never had a star, because I'm a subject British. I said, the Americans are already in Place de l'Étoile, on the Place of Étoile. I said, let me take off your yellow star. Nothing will happen to you. It could happen to you, they will take you with them because we were staying in line and they were running away, the soldiers. And their car and their everything, so their tender and their big cars, I don't know how they used to call them. And I took off the star from here. I said, you want to keep it for a souvenir or you want to take it? I take it, and I did. I was so mad that I didn't keep nothing for a souvenir. That was I said, go home, and if there are still friends or family who have the star, take them off yourself.
With clothes, which I could never dream about, and even if we would have had it in Lithuania, my parents couldn't afford it. So I carried that beautiful doll. When you bend her down, she says, Mama, isn't that wonderful? And I hug her, and everybody loved it. And one tall Russian comes over and he says to me, Почему? Why doesn't she say Papa? I said, she says only Mama. He grabs the doll and he kills it. He hits the doll because it didn't say Papa. Okay. And a young girl, and she couldn't make it. And they shot her in both her knees, and they just left her there. And I never forgot that. I always see her sitting on the ice with the blood running from her feet. And I say to myself, when I think about it now, didn't this man have children? How could he go back to his own teenage daughter? I wonder, how did they live with all this? How can a human being live with all this horror that he does to other people? It's hard for us to understand. For this and this part, we'll take you out to work. We need professors from college in this and this field. May all those men come and register. Well, the next day we found 500 men signed up from that caliber, and most of them were hanged. We saw them. And then some of them were killed even before they hanged them. To explain how that can happen from such a highly cultured country is beyond my understanding, and I'm sure many, many millions of people couldn't understand that. And the horror to watch people have pleasure of killing babies. No, bullets are too expensive for a baby. Take him by his feet and hit against the building.
I'm Daniel Kochavi. I was born in Colmar, France, in October of 1937. You know, we had this question initially, should I be a survivor? And I said, well, maybe I should be really a child survivor, which is true. I'm not in this whole story, as I looked at it, especially with the perspective of, listening to. The real survivor in that situation, was my mother. Under the occupation, even though she was relatively protected, it was still a very, not a very, could be a dangerous situation. And she was left alone with a 3-year-old child, and she had to fend for herself. And not only that, but then she did what she could for to help, other Jews who were much more in danger than she was, and she had to live by her wit. And so I think she's the one who's the real survivor, I think, in that situation. That is my father, of course, but he had, so they were not survivor the same as in the same way that people who have been in concentration camp and gone through that horrible situation. But in any case, and she paid a price for it mentally, because the rest of her life she became obsessively paranoid. She imagined there were all sorts of things were plotting, all sorts of plot and against her. Things that you and I would consider totally innocuous, she would interpret a totally different way.
So Daniel, let's take a little bit of time and have you introduce yourself, take us back to your childhood, your birthplace, a little bit about your history and how it ties into both the pre-war and moving into the war.
Okay. I'm Daniel Kochavi. I was born in Colmar, France, in October 1937. And my father's name is Israel, and my father was from Poland. Yeah. My mother was from Lithuania. My mother was born in a little shtetl town called Wilki, which was right outside Kaunas, or Kovno, as they called it then. And she was the oldest child in the family, and she also eventually had 9 siblings, I think. But then when she was born in 1911, and she moved to probably 1929, 1930. She moved to be with her aunt in Colmar, France. And she had an aunt and her married aunt and her uncle, of course. She then she stayed there for a year and then moved later to Paris, where she was there for another couple of years. 1930, early 1930s.
Okay.
And about the same time, she met my father. His name was Israel, and in 1932, I believe, they both decided to move to Palestine. I should preface that by saying that my father was born in 1905 in Tarnów, Poland. In his youth, as many other young people of his age, he became a devoted Zionist and actually went to Palestine in probably 1919 or 1920, and he was a pioneer for Chalutz, as I said, for a few years. Then he got sick and went back to Europe. Anyways, so that's his background. But in the meantime, as I said, in 1932, my mother and father decided to go back to Palestine, and they were married there. They were in Palestine at the time when it was under a British mandate. They were basically considered British subjects. And that's important because when my mother got pregnant with me in 1937, early 1937, and because of the tough climate and the heat, she had a hard time. She decided to move back, to leave Palestine, and she went back to Colmar to stay with her uncle who lived there.
The mandate system was a system that came out of the peace settlements after the First World War, when it became necessary to govern, by one means or another, all sorts of territories that had been previously occupied by those countries that were defeated in the war. In Britain's case, in Palestine, they were obliged to facilitate the growth of a Jewish national home in Palestine without prejudicing the rights of the original inhabitants, or the existing inhabitants of Palestine. The British occupied Palestine in 1918. They established a civil administration, that is, the army stops running daily affairs, in 1920. From 1920 until 1948, a period of 28 years, the British controlled Palestine, and although relations with the Jewish community ended up being very bad, in general, the Jews managed to build up a substantial Jewish national home from a population of 50 to 60,000 when the British enter Palestine to a population of approximately 550,000 when they leave Palestine, able to develop what was in fact a government in embryo. Overall, we must recognize that had it been any other sort of colonial administration in Palestine, it is very, very doubtful that a Jewish state would have emerged.
And of course, while she was traveling that way, she was traveling on British paper. She had a British passport or something like the equivalent of that. Anyways, and my father joined her maybe a few months later. So I was born, that's why I was born in Colmar in France. They didn't have they didn't have a profession to speak of. My mother, after I was born, she eventually got a position with a fairly well-known rabbi in Paris to be the governess or the nanny for his children. And my father got Paris had the French establishment, the French Jewish establishment, at the it was called ORT, which is a trade school for teenage men, boys, and he got a job with them as a kind of to help them to keep their supplies up or whatever needs. So not a manager of the school, but kind of a superintendent, if you will. And of course, in 1939, the Germans invaded Poland, but not much happened on the Western Europe front as far as the war was concerned. I guess the Germany and Hitler were occupied with what they were, the horrible thing they were doing in Poland. But finally, I think in May, or probably May on that time, May or April or May, they decided to invade 1940, and that was what's called the Blitzkrieg. Within 2 months, they had taken over Holland, they had taken over Belgium, and by June they were already in France. And if you remember, France capitulated to the Germans in June of 1940.
Organized resistance in France was no longer possible. The government faced 2 alternatives: retire to North Africa and carry on from there, or give up the struggle. France's leaders were old and tired, and the oldest and most tired was Marshal Pétain. Egged on by men like Laval, who saw in a German victory his chance for personal power, on June 16th, Pétain asked for an armistice. The news is carried to Hitler, who received this word of a great nation's fall in a characteristic manner. Also characteristic were his terms for the armistice. It must be signed in the coach where Marshal Foch met the defeated Germans in the last war. The French delegation arrives to pay the final price of French disunity and the treachery of some of its leaders. The final price, a price that for centuries to come, the French won't forget. More than 3/5 of their country was to be blacked out by a military occupation. The remainder was to be controlled by a French government acceptable to Hitler. A tax of 400 million francs a day was to be imposed on the French people to support the German army of occupation. Nearly 2 million French prisoners of war were to be taken into Germany and kept there as hostages, to work as slaves or rot of hunger, tuberculosis, or other diseases in concentration camps. Men deliberately and permanently separated from their families in order to decrease the French birth rate and thus eliminate France as a world power in future generations. French civilians, men, women, and children, must slave on farm or in factory for the Nazi master race or starve. There will be a class of subject alien races. We need not hesitate to call them slaves.
The French police decided to round up all the foreign nationals because, that was the standard thing. They were afraid they might be spies and all that. So in December, and I remember in December 1940, I know that we were rounded up with other people by the French police actually at the time. And I do remember we had to walk from where we lived to the city hall. It turns out they were walking. They took us from our house to the local city hall, and at that point, the men were separated from the women and children. And to make a long story short, my father ended up he was relocated in different little camps, and he ended up in a kind of what was probably at one time an army barracks outside Paris in a town called Saint-Denis, or a suburb called Saint-Denis, which still exists now, and where all the foreign nationals were imprisoned there for the duration of the occupation. Because my parents were considered British subjects, they had a British passport or the equivalent, and all their paper, remember, everybody, all the Jews that didn't have that kind of status, their paper was stamped with a J, being they're Jewish. That did not happen to my parents, to my mother or my father. And so not only that, but because of that, they did not have to wear even the yellow stars that all the Jews had to wear. My father went to Saint-Denis, it ended up in Saint-Denis, and my mother and I, we were, with all of the other women and children, were shipped to a camp in East France, in a town called Besançon. That's the name of the town, Besançon. And we were kept there for about 2 months. And I don't know but the condition, as my mother described them, were pretty horrible there. There was it was in the middle of the winter. Remember, the roundup was in December. It was a very cold and snowy winter. And the barracks were old army barracks, pretty dilapidated. There was no heat. There was no hygiene, minimal hygiene. And even though some of the local people tried to help, it was kind of a preview, if you will, of what eventually concentration camps was going to be like. For 2 months, the Red Cross had managed to arrange for everybody, all the women, especially women with children, to be released. And we returned to her story that my mother told. She became, like I said, because of her special status, she could circulate relatively freely through Paris. She didn't have to. Of course, you were afraid. You never know. But at least she was able to circulate freely, and she made connection with the local resistance, and she used her facility or her ability to act as a courier. Like sometimes the resistance would issue to help, especially to help Jewish refugees who knew they were going to be deported. And So she would get, from the resistance, she would get either false ID for some people who could get to escape, or she'd somehow get connection to smugglers who were able to help people get out of that situation. And then I remember one of the people that she helped was there were people who were very close friends of ours, and they had a son who was about my age, and she found out that they were sometime just before it happened. They found out that they were about to be arrested. So she was working for Hort, remember that school? They were running a kitchen where they served lunch or for the students, and she ran the kitchen for them. So she had an apartment in that building. But anyway, so she had our friends come, and she said she had them come and stay with her and with a child for a few days and she found somebody to help them to smuggle them out of Paris to go. So every night she had to go to the local police station and report her address, because that's what the British foreign national were supposed to do. But what happened, I don't know exactly how he found out, but she got worried that eventually the German would really catch on or find her, and eventually everybody was arrested anyways toward the end of the war. So in 1943, she decided to go into hiding, but she didn't want me to be with her. So what she did, she found a local, it's interesting, it was a Catholic boarding school for girls, and she talked to the director, and she arranged to have me stay with at that school, as I was passed as I think the son of the director or something of it. And I was there. So it was a Catholic school, and I was there till that was in early 1944, maybe January or February, I'm not sure. And I was there till Paris was liberated, till August of 1944. So I was kind of, hidden, if you will, during that period.
And do you have any information about what was happening with your father?
My father, nothing. I actually, because we were able to travel freely, my mother, because of that, we would go visit him once in a while. We would go she would take the metro. I remember, I still have kind of picture of that, sitting and taking a long ride in the metro to Saint-Denis and to go visit, visit him for, I remember there were long benches where, the men were sitting on one side and the visitor, the mother, on the other side. And I think in that camp, they, maybe through the Red Cross, they would get packages of, from abroad that people would send in, and my father they would kind of have to do that secretly, hiding. He would give my mother some of these, it could be like cans of meat or sometimes cigarettes, and he would pass them on, and she could use that to, to make trades when exactly. So there was, but like I said, the fact that what really made a big difference is having those papers prevented, probably saved us from being deported.
So Daniel, I want to kind of bridge the gap between your mother's sister, your aunt Betty, and who lived in Lithuania, and your relationship between your aunt, your mother, and you. So maybe you can give some background about that triangle.
Well, whatever. Well, okay, here is what happened. One thing I should also add before I go is that we already talked about Betty, what happened to her while she was in Lithuania, and all the time, her older sister, not my mother, but another older sister, Pauline or Polke, was with her at the same time. They went together. But anyways, somehow what happened is that my mother, through various contact and correspondence, managed to make contact with both Pauline and Betty through letters. Maybe first through Pauline and then Betty. Anyway, the upshot is that Betty and Isaac were married by then, somehow showed up one day into they had our address. They showed up where we lived in Paris, and they were reunited with my mother, and as did Pauline too, and she was married to her husband too. And I remember those days very well because, basically Betty was essentially 10 years older than me. So at the time she was young, a young woman, all of a sudden in Paris after all this horrible stuff that happened to her. So she was like my big sister, and we used to have a really relate that way at the time. And we maintained that kind of relation all through our life.
You were how old? How old were you at that time?
Well, I was, that would have been when she came in 44, so I was what, 8 or 9?
So she was
44.
So she was 18. What about Pauline?
Yeah.
How old?
No, she was old. Pauline was about, she was, I think, about 3 years younger than my mother, so she must have been probably in her mid-20s, yeah.
And my sister and my brother, which are already dead, and my father, they had just time, somebody of the Christian neighbor came and they said, they are burning the Torah and they are destroying the synagogue.
Let's go back. How old were you when the war broke out?
29 years.
And how did the first word of the war reach you?
We read in the newspaper that Germany occupied Poland. Then right away we heard in the radio, in the Parisian radio.
What are your first memories of the war?
What that in 1 day, in 2 days, in 3 days, all grocery store was empty, and you feel already a shortage in food. That is my fear. And I had a little child, and we, the Jewish people, since I wasn't the only, we were so scared right away that the Nazis will come to France, that since nobody ran to the stores. When we call him Papa a little bit, there was nothing anymore there.
Depuis toujours, dans notre vieille famille, on est ailleurs, de père en fils. Depuis 100 ans, là-haut l'enseigne brille, dans la rue de l'écrevisse. Mets-toi le nez, plongé dans les livres, tu étudies au lieu de bien couper. Ce n'est pas tout, hein, il faut aussi vivre. Gagner l'argent au lieu de rêvasser. Schmile, tes vêtements n'ont pas de style. T'es pas un tailleur habile. Regarde la fille du voisin, comme déjà il coupe bien. Ses pantalons, ses gilets, ses vestons, quel bonheur pour les parents d'avoir au monde un tel enfant. Ta jambe gauche, elle est trop longue, ta jambe droite, n'en parlons pas. Tu seras toujours quelconque si tu ne m'écoutes pas. Schmile, tes vêtements n'ont pas de style. T'es pas un tailleur habile. Et je suis des Schmile, tes vêtements n'ont pas de style. T'es pas un tailleur